المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل، مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل، مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل، مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل، مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل، مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل، مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا.
This panel will look at evaluating UNRWA's role in the development of Palestine refugee camps. Palestine camps and the structures are continuously at risk of targeting from Israeli authorities during military operations. They've also been multiple times the site of war and conflict between different actors, which caused Palestinians to be caught in the crossfire. And UNRWA has taken on various post-war reconstruction projects in recent years, some of which remain incomplete. Ongoing conflicts, which severely affect Palestinian refugees, also raise the question of whether these camps will be rebuilt in the near future. The refugee camp is also the site where Palestinian identity is constructed and from which Palestinian return can be imagined, planned, and implemented. This panel will investigate the dynamics at play in the evolving existence of Palestinian refugee camps. I think it's a good follow-up from some of the discussions we had this morning, and we can have some good questions from all of you at the end, I think. I'm going to call on Sophie, our first speaker, who's an associate professor in the Women's Society and Development Program at the College of Humanities and Social Science at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Sophie?
Thank you, Karen, for introducing me. Well, I want to start, first of all, by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here for this very important event and among such distinguished speakers. I also want to apologize for my voice. I hope it will last until the end of the talk. I have a cold, but I think it will last for these 20 minutes. So the title of my talk is Thinking Beyond the Nation, Narratives of Camp, Home and Homeland Among Young Palestinian Refugees. I come to this topic where I would like to shift the discussion a little bit more to the micro level, because I come to this topic as a political ethnographer who has done work in the camps in Lebanon, West Bank, and Jordan. So I want to, as an ethnographer, look at the identities and the political narratives that young Palestinian refugees themselves formulate in the context of the camps. And I take up in my paper Arjun Appadurai's 96 call that we need to think ourselves beyond the nation. And so I want to trace how young Palestinian refugees interrogate and rethink the national, the nation state, the nation from their positionalities on the margins of the yet-to-be Palestinian nation state. So Palestinian refugees, of course, speak from a particular specific positionality. First of all, they speak from the positionality of those expelled, displaced, and dispossessed at the hands of the Israeli settler colonial regime. But they also speak from the positionality at the margins of the national order of things, as Lisa Malki called it, at the margins of the yet-to-be Palestinian nation state. So from this very specific intersecting positionality, how do young Palestinian refugees challenge nation-statist frameworks, and how do they in fact think beyond the nation? Do they propose post-national scenarios that perhaps challenge the classic nexus between nation, state, and territory? In my talk, I'll draw on long-term ethnographic fieldwork that I've conducted with Ruba Saleh in different camps, but also not outside the camps in Jordan, Palestine, and the West Bank, Jordan, West Bank, and Lebanon. We spent many months between 2009 and 2015 speaking to refugees from different backgrounds about their political cultures. But I'll focus specifically on the West Bank here, and specifically this is because of time, and the three contexts are very different, so I found it hard to squeeze everything in one presentation. So I'll focus specifically on the West Bank and specifically on the conversations that we had with younger Palestinian refugees in the camps. So I'd like to show then in this presentation that young Palestinian camp refugees in the West Bank indeed break with more classic Palestinian nation-statist discourses. Of course, their first loyalty lies with their homeland, Palestine, and their right to return is an inalienable right. But they also often narrate their identities to state and sovereignties, to territory and land, and to home and camp as more complex, multiple, and somewhat hyphenated. So with this introduction, let me move to the actual narratives. Given the ongoing settler colonization of Palestinian life and land in the West Bank, one of the major issues that young refugees speak about in the camps is the question of political representation. Who will uphold their rights as Palestinians, but also specifically as refugees? So many of the interviews we spoke to were thinking through their own very difficult positionality as being refugees in their own homeland, and thus also their relation to the Palestinian Authority. This was especially so when we conducted fieldwork in 2012. It was at a time when Abbas had just renounced his right of return. He had said, and I quote, "It's my right to see Safat, but not to live there," his village of origin. So this statement, as you know, as you very well know, caused a very big stir and debate and opposition among Palestinian refugees worldwide, but it was also very much discussed in the Heysha refugee camp where we were at the time. And one of the young refugees there, I'll call him Mahmoud, told us the following in response to Abbas's statement. He said, "There are 9 million Palestinians who can't give up the right of return. Did you, as the president of the PA, before you issued that statement, did you think about those 9 million? That's what I'm asking. I'm waiting for the refugees themselves to come out with the final decision." So I think his words are very powerful, and they point to two interrelated issues. The first is the question of representation. Who represents Palestinian refugees? And Mahmoud here echoed a very common stance among young refugees across Jordan, Palestine, and Lebanon, that they do not accept that the PA speaks on their behalf. And this was particularly so in the West Bank, where refugees are living with a very complex and paradoxical situation of having the PA both as their host government and their national representative. So it's a very particular situation as well. Some young refugees that we spoke to, they were even thinking about alternative or new structures of political representation for refugees, such as Mahmoud, when he was saying that he is waiting for the refugees themselves to come out with a final decision. Others spoke of a specific refugee political party that should be formed and represent refugees. I'm giving these as insights into the political debates that were going on among the young refugees. Of course, such proposals are by no means agreed upon by all refugees, right? Nor are they formulated in a coherent political strategy or programs. But I think, and I would argue, that they nevertheless offer a very interesting insight into a very specific post-Oslo refugee political imaginary and refugee political identity, which clearly responds to the continuous abandonment of that the refugees have experienced after Oslo. So the second issue that emerges from the quote relates precisely to the Oslo Accords and the questions of territory. Mahmoud expressed very well refugees' disillusionment with the PA's post-Oslo negotiation and state agenda, and two-states agenda. As we know, refugees were excluded from this post-Oslo nation status imaginary, with their right of return somewhat infinitely delayed or forgotten. Return risked to mean a return to the fraction of a Palestinian state within the 67 borders. So very wary of such Tautin scenarios, many young refugees keep a critical distance to the official political structures of the PA and stress their own specificity as refugees, also in political terms. The nation-state territory nexus proposed by Oslo, however, not only risks signing away refugee rights, it also does not capture the lived realities and feelings of attachment of most Palestinian refugees. As members of the Palestinian nations, but guests in the PA-administered areas, the ways in which young camp refugees feel about their own identity and narrate their very complex feelings of belonging do not necessarily fit within the narrow and reductionist two-state solution and the territorialized nation-state that is projected there. Let me give the example of Yazan's voice, a refugee who at the time was in his 30s from Tulkarm refugee camp. His family is originally from Miske, just a few kilometers on the other side of the border. And he, in his words, questioned this idea of roots in national territory. When he asked how he would like to live in the future, Yazan provided the following scenario. He said, "I could go and live there in Miska, but I would always come back to Tulkarm. I do not want to have to go back to Miska. I could decide and live in Jaffa as well. I can go and decide to live wherever I want." So you see from his narrative that he emphasizes very much attachments to multiple places, including Tulkarem and, of course, the village of origin, but also Jaffa. Jaffa, yes. Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was Jaffa. So when we ask him what he meant by Tulkarem, whether he meant the camp or the town, Yazan stressed also very much his attachment to the camp as a home, one of his many homes. Such an understanding of the camp, not just as a temporary space of dispossession and displacement, but also in a way as a space of home and as part and parcel of refugee lived experiences, was also stressed by other young refugees in the Haitian camp. When we asked them about the future of the camp in the case of return, in the case of their return, youth in the Haitian suggested that the camp be transformed into a museum that should act as witness to the 1948 Nakba and to the lives of refugees in the camp. So understanding the camp as a museum revalues the camp not as an abject place to be erased and forgotten and overcome, but rather also as a place to be celebrated and to be engraved in collective memory. This kind of understanding of the camp as witness and testimony to refugee life and identity also for some holds very specific political meaning. So Ahmed, another young refugee from the Haitian camp, reflected on the camp in the following way. He said, maybe it's crazy, but in my view, whoever lives in the camp is a citizen of the camp, not of the PA and not of UNRWA. Because I know someday UNRWA will leave. The point is, we have been living here for 64 years. We have emotions, and all our life is in the camps. In his political imaginary, as citizen of the camp, Ahmed thus frames his attachment to the camp effectively, but also very much politically. He is a political subject, a citizen of the camp rather than of the PA and UNRWA, as he states. Now, trying to soften my voice. So additionally to the camp, and as we saw in Yazan's quote from Tulkarem, young camp refugees, of course, also stressed that they would like to maintain their links and networks to other localities all over Palestine, including the village of origin, but also other places. This generation's translocal political proposals of living between and across different localities thus, in a way, challenges simultaneously two very entrenched political discourses. The first is the one of a nostalgic primordialist notion that binds people to singular roots, to the village of origin. And the second is a narrow nation-state paradigm that confines the nation to national borders and territories. I'm not saying that these two very important political discourses have been abandoned. Not at all. They are core and parcel to the Palestinian refugee narratives. But we see in young refugees' narratives also an enrichment and perhaps a complication of these two discourses. And they are drawing these narratives from their own lived experiences of displacement and possession and the forms of belonging these kinds of lives gave to. So to sum up, I think that for the younger generation of Palestinian refugees, it's very clear. The PA's narrow two-state nation-statist political program has failed to accommodate their voices, rights, and demands. Consequently, they are looking for and are searching for alternative representative structures, but also for alternative political programs that go beyond this territorialist, reductionist two-state solution. All of this, and I mean this is very important to stress, all of this, of course, takes place within the context of an ever-tightening, omnipresent, and intrusive settler colonial control and violence over their lives. So it is, as I said at the start of my talk, it is from this specific positionality where refugees are those subjected to very violent settler nationalist expansionism, but also located at the margins of the nation-state to be, that they come up with questioning the national order of things, or trying to think beyond the two-statist national framework. It's also important, therefore, to understand that these translocal, or maybe we can call them post-national imaginings, in the case of young Palestinian refugees, clearly do not stem from them having practiced free transnational lives in a kind of celebratory tone of the decrees of the nation state. I mean, it's precisely the opposite. It's because this generation has had to experience national borders and the violences of checkpoints as very violent mechanisms of control, categorization, and divide and rule that they come up with new scenarios. For them, borders as identitarian and territorial dividing lines are not something natural, but must be questioned. So I think perhaps it's precisely because they have been, as refugees, all their lives been excluded from and never been able to actually reap the benefits of national borders and territorial sovereignty, that they are now pushing for a just solution for their rights as refugees and as Palestinians that kind of obliges them to go beyond a narrow two-state solution framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. That was excellent. I appreciate that. We'll be getting some questions, I'm sure. Our next speaker is Terry Rempel, and he's an independent researcher. He will explain some of the things that he's been working on. And he's recently published the Palestinian Yearbook of International Law. This is forthcoming. He will tell us more about that. And if you want to be in touch with him, he has a blog at www.palrefs.com. So put that down. Terry.
Thank you. It's good to be here. If you don't mind, I'm going to take off my jacket. I was born and raised on a farm, and we have work.
This is live TV.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, we have work to do, so I'm always more comfortable rolling up my sleeves and getting to work. Before the fight, exactly. Thank you, Sophie, for that reminder of a complex set of connections and develop over place and time that are part of identity. One of my connections to Palestine, this year is 100 years since my grandparents came to Canada as refugees. And a second set of that set of connections is the fact that something I didn't learn growing up in school, and folks of my age didn't learn, was the fact that I come in Canada from Treaty 6 territory, and specifically the land of the Beaver Cree, historic land. So I want to acknowledge that before starting. Okay, so in the brief time that I have this afternoon, I would like to spend a few minutes looking back as a way of looking forward. I was wondering what I was going to say about this in the title of this panel, since camps is not something that is, it's part of my broader work and research on refugees, but not something that is specifically I work on focused. And it struck me the title was interesting, and I'll explain this image in a bit. The title struck me as suggesting both a backward-looking and a forward-looking approach, the making and the unmaking, notwithstanding the fact that making and unmaking in the Palestinian context and camps is much more complex than simply a binary of past and present. Camps, in many ways, as we already heard that Karen mentioned, had to be remade many times over in some cases due to armed conflict. As evident in the title of this conference, moreover, UNRWA at 70, there is much history to consider. This is not the first time that the agency has been the focus of reflection. 10 years ago, staff, stakeholders, scholars, activists, and refugees themselves gathered in Beirut on the agency's 60th anniversary to examine UNRWA's evolution from relief and works to human development, with a collection of studies subsequently published under the same title. In the late 1990s, a number of panelists for this conference took part in a research project focused on the political economy of humanitarian aid and development for Palestinian refugees, UNRWA's organizational culture, and the oral history of Palestinian refugees. And preceding this project by a few years, when the launch of political negotiations between Israel and the PLO generated initial optimism that the agency might be approaching an a retirement, Benjamin Schiff authored a book on the agency's history entitled Refugees Unto the Third Generation. Nearly 25 years later, the span of a generation, that title is now out of date, which gives us an indication of both the weight of history before us today and the enormity of the challenges that lie ahead for UNRWA, and most importantly, for refugees themselves. The point is frequently made that refugee studies, with its origin in policy-relevant research and prescription to protracted refugee situations in the final decade of the Cold War, gives little room for historical reflection. It is also said sometimes that policymakers and humanitarian practitioners likewise often view history as too political or a luxury in the context of fast-moving and pressing humanitarian emergencies. As Philip Marfleet reminds us, however, new and renewed crises of refugees, such as those in Iraq, Darfur, Zimbabwe, Somalia, and Sri Lanka, and I would add Palestine, each speak of the past. They are the outcome of complex colonial legacies, global developments, external interventions, local tensions, and conflicts, and none can be understood without history. With 70 years of history to consider, one might easily identify past experiences relevant to UNRWA's future and the future of refugees themselves. To cite one pressing example to illustrate the point, the sustained efforts by organizations and individuals aligned with the right-wing and neoconservative movements in Israel, US, and in my own country, Canada, over the last 10 to 15 years, and elsewhere in the world, to undermine UNRWA's credibility, have in many ways their origins in the early 1980s, when one finds some of the same organizations, same individuals making the same arguments for the same overarching reason. That is to say, to eliminate the perceived threat that Palestinian refugees, and therefore UNRWA, with its mandate for their assistance and protection, are believed to pose to Israel's future as a Jewish state. To reflect on 7 decades is well beyond the scope of this short and I hope a bit expanded intervention. The perspectives that you have already heard today and will hear in the hours that remain of this conference offer but glimpses, as you will have already realized, albeit very important ones, into UNRWA's history and the refugees that it continues to serve. In the remaining time, I would like to take you back 60 years, which will explain this postage stamp in a bit, to a time when UNRWA's future was very much a source of discussion. There is much here in this period, whether in Palestine, Israel, the wider Arab region, and elsewhere in the world, that is relevant to UNRWA and the circumstances of Palestinian refugees. Unfortunately, the time does not permit discussion of all those contextual issues. As far as UNRWA is concerned, the challenges the agency faced were not unfamiliar, as I said, from discussions about its refugee definition, to budget shortfalls and austerity measures, questions about whether UNRWA was fulfilling its mandate, and occasional talk even of shuttering the agency completely. With its mandate up for renewal in June 1960, the director's annual reports reveal an agency engaged in both reflection on what had not worked and thoughtful analysis of what might be needed in the future in light of the continued absence of a political solution that would enable refugees to exercise their right to return or find new homes elsewhere. So getting to the stamp, I would like to focus my brief comments on this postage stamp, which was issued during the UN-designated World Refugee Year that began in June 1959. Commemorative stamps like this one, issued by the United Arab Republic, were part of an array of measures and activities that aimed to draw attention to the global refugee situation by telling, in the words of a UN pamphlet, the refugee story. According to Dr. Elfyn Rees, the executive director of World Refugee Year, an estimated 40 million people had been displaced since World War II, with many refugees, including Palestinians, living in what today are described as protracted refugee situations already. Inspired in part by the visit of two British journalists to Palestinian refugee camps in the Middle East, World Refugee Year aimed to raise funds for humanitarian assistance and facilitate solutions through repatriation, local integration, or resettlement. Here again, we find some similarities, broadly speaking, to the challenge and global response to forced displacement today. In the context of World Refugee Year, UNRWA hoped to raise $4 million, a quarter of what would be needed for its proposed 3-year expanded program of education and vocational training. Dr. John Davis, who took over the agency as director in early 1959, also hoped to use the heightened attention to clear up what he described as a number of misconceptions about UNRWA and the refugees that had emerged over the previous years. As part of this second effort, UNRWA started a newsletter called Palestine Refugees Today, which ran until 1996, and issued a number of additional publications and films. It also hosted a visit by Yul Brynner of the King and I fame, with photographs and a narrative account bundled together with images and stories of refugees elsewhere from around the world. And I'll just leave that on a table front if anyone wants to come up later and look at it. Now, I would like to make 3 short comments relating to the theme of this panel and the broader focus of the conference by reflecting on 3 aspects of the image in this stamp: the tent, the refugees, and the homeland, that comprise the overall picture or representation of Palestinian refugees. While the following reflections draw upon a broader body of archival documents, scholarly, and popular literature, the interpretation is nevertheless my own, and one made without knowledge of the artist or recourse to research about his or her work. You'll hear some of the names of scholars as we go along, and I mention them simply to recognize the ideas and the work of others that are central to this presentation. Now, the panel of 3 images starts with a tented settlement here, which seems hardly surprising given the ubiquity of the tent as a symbol or representation of forced displacement. Its use here, nevertheless, is interesting to me in that by the time World Refugee Year began, UNRWA was in the final stages of replacing tents with more permanent or at least durable shelters. In fact, if you look in this book, of all the photographs here, there is only one photograph of all the camps that Brynner visited that has, it's not a camp, but tents, and that's a photograph of displaced Bedouin, which in itself offers interesting reflections about conceptualizations and representation of the Bedouin. Not so much a reflection then of their living conditions at the time. I suspect that what the artist intended to convey was a sense of uprootedness, of being away from home, and the temporary nature of exile. Interestingly, nearly 4 decades later, on the eve of final status negotiations between the PLO and Israel, refugees and their partners in the West Bank launched a campaign for the defense of Palestinian refugee rights with the slogan, 50 years under the tent. The campaign poster depicted a tent, and inside was the stump of an olive tree, a contrasting symbol of rootedness. Keeping our gaze on the years and decades that followed World Refugee Year, one might further argue that the tent has also come to symbolize the ongoing nature of Palestinian displacement, most notably, as you will know, as a result of the 1967 war. It is these 2 wars and the mass displacement of Palestinians that ensued that, in the words of Rosemary Sayegh, has informed conventional tellings of the Palestinian refugee story as 2 big bangs, 1948 and 1967, which scattered Palestinians into a limited number of agglomerations where their presence is stable and statistically known. A quick survey of UNRWA's annual reports over the years and decades, however, that followed 1967, up to the very present, reveals the agency's continued need for and use of tents to shelter Palestinians uprooted, in some cases many times over, on both sides of the 1949 armistice line dividing Israel from the territories it occupied in 1967 and elsewhere in the Arab region. So the point that I want to make with this first image of the tent is that how one conceptualizes or understands the situation of Palestinian refugees over place and time has important implications for understanding and addressing its root cause. Janet Abulugh's provocative characterization of Palestinians as exiles at home and abroad, with its implicit focus on structured inequality that is a fundamental element of settler colonial regimes, seems to me particularly useful here in identifying and unpacking the root or underlying cause of Palestinian displacement over time. In the introduction entitled Past is Present, Settler Colonialism in Palestine, the editors of a recent issue of the journal Settler Colonial Studies described Fayez Sayeg's study on Zionist colonialism in Palestine, penned only a few years after World Refugee Year, as, quote, arguably one of the clearest and most potent analysis of its generation, unquote. It is Patrick Wolf's more recent assertion, moreover, that settler colonial regimes are governed by what he describes as the logic of elimination of the native that further helps to make sense of the ongoing nature of Palestinian displacement over the course of a century. When asked to identify reasons why Israel has denied their right to return to homes and places of origin inside the Jewish state in a recent survey, refugee youth in UNRWA camps and internally displaced youth inside Israel pointed to racism as the primary #1 factor. So turning to the second image of 2 young refugees, this seems fitting given UNRWA's goal of raising funds during World Refugee Year to help underwrite the expansion of its education and vocational training program. It also seems appropriate in light of the agency efforts to promote equal access to education and vocational training among girls and boys, which UNRWA achieved in the 1960s. Of further interest is the contrast between the agency's frequent and growing concern in its reports about what it described as the idleness and loss of morale among refugees, which UNRWA hoped to mitigate through the expansion of its youth activity centers during World Refugee Year. Writing in 1960, John Davis, the director, expressed hope that the program would, quote, not only alleviate the immediate problem of idleness, but also prove of value in the formation of responsible citizens of the future. Many decades later, it was the youth activity centers in the occupied West Bank that played a major role in the establishment of a popular refugee movement based on principles of, quote, democracy, pluralism, flexibility, and tolerance, unquote, and the launch of what the previously mentioned Campaign for the Defense of Palestinian Refugee Rights. So it was this type of activism that I suspect the artist behind the stamp had in mind when he or she placed 2 young refugees at its center. Emerging from the tented settlement behind them, it is an important reminder, as a colleague pointed out to me last night during the screening of Flying Paper by the Palestine Film Festival and the Hoping Foundation, a documentary which I encourage you all to see, that refugee camps are also vibrant places of community, creativity, and optimism. As Peter Gatrell shows in The Making of the Modern Refugee, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, I would add, refugee camps have also been places of collective rehabilitation and reconstruction, frequently organized along national lines in order to facilitate repatriation. The establishment of Palestinian refugee camps are no different. The central image of 2 young refugees with their arms outstretched towards Palestine contrasts also with the overtly humanitarian and sometimes abject representation of refugees in some of the other stamps issued for World Refugee Year, with refugees themselves, in Gatrell's analysis, playing little, if no role in the campaign itself. It is a reminder of Lisa Malky's observation of how humanitarian and development interventions can sometimes leach out the histories and the politics of specific refugee circumstances that are so necessary to finding solutions. The point that I want to bring out here then with this second image is one that the political philosopher Hannah Arendt made nearly a decade before World Refugee Year in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she observes that it was not the loss of specific rights, but the loss of a community, willing and able to guarantee any rights whatsoever that had been the calamity of the ever-increasing number of displaced people in the world. Drawing in part on Arendt's ideas, in a book interestingly entitled The Refugee in International Society, Between Sovereigns, Emma Haddad describes Palestinians as perhaps, quote, one of the most enduring reminders of the 20th century of the attempt to make nations, states, and territory coincide, unquote. Taking this idea one step further, Katie Long explains in a recent UNHCR evaluation that, quote, understanding forced flight as a form of political exclusion means that the methods employed to solve refugee crisis must also necessarily be political, which suggests, as she goes on to argue, that political participation of refugees must play a key role in moving the displaced beyond exile. This is a point which, if I'm not mistaken, both Karen and Antonio Gutierrez, in their respective roles as Commissioner General and High Commissioner, made to the Security Council in 2009 on participation. As to identify factors that prevented the re-emergence of an individual and collective return movement today, refugee and IDP youth, in the same poll mentioned previously, pointed first and foremost to a fear of Israeli persecution, along with physical and administrative barriers that prevented movement. Turning to the third then and final image in the stamp is a map of Palestine stretching from the Nakab or Negev in the south to the far reaches of the Galilee in the north. The image may seem somewhat surprising given the dissolution of Palestine during the 1948 war, the establishment of the State of Israel in nearly 4/5 of the country, Jordan's annexation of the West Bank, and Egyptian administration of the Gaza Strip. The apparent juxtaposition between the General Assembly's resolve in paragraph 11 of Resolution 194 of December 1948, which said that refugees should be permitted to return to their homes, and the collective return to a homeland that appears implicit in the stamp, is of course more understandable when viewed in the context of the reemergence of a Palestinian national movement in the 50s and 60s, with the interrelated objectives of liberation and return. Whether through the plan drafted in 1960-61 by Joseph Johnson, a special representative of the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, UNRWA's sister organization, or through unofficial efforts by panels of experts, which included figures like Hannah Arendt, the focus nevertheless remained on the return of individual refugees to homes rather than to a homeland. 40 years later, moreover, the popular refugee movement, in the context of a two-state solution, similarly called for recognition and implementation of the individual right of return. And this understanding of return as an individual right is consistent with recent survey findings of refugee youth and IDPs inside Israel. In contrast, it seems clear that the artist's depiction in this stamp of the homeland was informed by the previously mentioned prevailing discourse at the time of World Refugee Year around liberation and return. Far from a new concept, Palestinian Arab representatives repeatedly raised this understanding of return in discussions of the drafting of Resolution 194 without success and without even a response from any of the other members of the committee. That said, there seems to me to be another possible reading of this image when the map of the homeland is viewed in combination with the stamp's central image, the two young refugees with their hands outstretched towards Palestine. Well, the national movement re-emerging from the camps and tents and communities of exile in the 50s and 60s emphasized that the return of refugees would occur through liberation of the homeland, i.e., they would return after the homeland was liberated. The stamp's chronology to me, the refugees coming first and then Palestine coming later, appears to suggest that liberation, in this sense I mean freedom, justice, and equality, might in fact be the product or end result of the struggle for the right to return. Well, this may be an overreading of the artist's intent. The reading seems appealing to me in the sense that the right of return focuses squarely on the root cause of the long-running struggle, if my analysis previously is correct. That is to say, the right to return is the one issue on which the State of Israel openly acknowledges to directly discriminate against Palestinians on the basis of their race or nationality, with similar distinctions being central to the structure of political, economic, and legal privileges that undergird the country's settler colonial regime. And these, as you know, have been this inequality, as you know, has been recently enshrined as a constitutional principle in the basic law on the nation state. The final point then with this last image that I want to make is this. The homeland, whether one refers to it as Palestine, Israel, or a combination of the two, is both a physical or geographical space, and at the same time it is a place of community, identity, and belonging. The successful return of refugees, as some of the above-mentioned scholars have pointed out, requires that each of these two aspects be addressed. While problems relating to the physical return of refugees to their homes, lands, and properties have received considerable attention over the last 2 decades, the return of refugees to their homeland as citizenship, in the fullest sense of the term, that is to say, the creation of a new social contract, whatever the construct of a political solution might be, has received far less attention and arguably remains one of the toughest challenges ahead. In this sense, and I'm wrapping up here shortly, to use a contrast made by Rashid Khalidi in an essay on the right to return in the early 1990s, there is no absolute justice. What has been lost over the course of more than 70 years and longer cannot be fully restored as it was then. And what exists today in terms of the structured inequality that pervades almost every aspect of life for Palestinians on both sides of the 1949 armistice line surely cannot remain as it is. Justice, in this sense, is only attainable, and its prospect seems to depend in large part on proper conceptualization of the long-running struggle with the refugees, their right to return, and their participation placed front and center. So what does this mean for UNRWA as an agency, as it navigates what is already and promises to be a rough transition into a 7th decade? It's probably a topic for another conference. With little time remaining, I can only humbly suggest that the outcome of World Refugee Year, along with the issues raised by the images in this stamp that aim to draw attention to the refugee condition or situation, seem to offer some important issues for reflection even 60 years later. By the end of the global campaign in the summer of 1960, UNRWA had exceeded its fundraising target by several $100,000. But refugees remain stuck in what has become one of the largest
What's it say?
Introducing UNRWA has become one of the largest, introducing one of the largest and most protracted situations in the world today. Introducing UNRWA's 1960 annual report, John Davis, the director, who would oversee the agency's next 3-year program, writes, UNRWA itself cannot solve the refugee problem. Any solution to the complex Palestine problem, of which the refugee problem is a part, albeit an important one, will be brought about largely by forces outside UNRWA, forces which will govern and shape the future of the Middle East, and UNRWA can and should work in harmony with those forces. Through the delivery of essential services, namely basic education, health, Relief and Welfare, Davis continued, the agency will be alleviating human suffering, equipping young refugees to lead useful and productive lives, irrespective of where they may live, and supporting the general stability in the Middle East. This, in turn, he argued, will be conducive to the creation of a climate that will enable the forces that shape the region to work in a more orderly manner. Several years later, David Forsyth, drawing upon Johan Galtung's concept of peace building, characterized UNRWA's approach, its new three-year program, which continued to evolve in subsequent years and decades up to the present, as a form of, quote, peace servicing, unquote. It may be that the issues raised by the representation of refugees during World Refugee Year in 1959-1960, from conceptualization of the root or underlying cause of forced displacement, political exclusion, inclusion, and participation, along with the homeland and citizenship in terms of community, identity, and belonging, provide important markers for reflection about how UNRWA and the international community more broadly, quote, services peace, unquote, in the coming years and decades. With the greatest respect to the work that UNRWA, through its many thousands of staff, local and international, has done, 70 years is 7 decades too long. But serious reflection on each of the above issues that I've identified will require tremendous patience and perseverance. Listening takes time, and equally important, serious action requires struggle. As UNRWA moves into its septuagenarian years, I think we can all agree that refugees deserve no less.
Thanks a lot for that, Terry. Gives us some hope, even if it's going to take a long time. Yeah. And now we'll have the journalist point of view from Ahmed Hussein, Palestinian activist and journalist, born in Syria, his BA from Damascus University. Nice. And he's co-founded several pro-Palestinian youth initiatives in Syria and devoted much of his career to speaking up for the Palestinian right of return. So he's volunteered as a relief officer in southern Damascus. I'd like to hear that. And founded the Action Group for Palestinians of Syria. And he's been documenting all sorts of human rights accounts and violations against the Palestinian refugees inside and outside Syria, particularly in the Khan Sheikh camp and the Al Yarmouk camps when they've come under their crippling sieges. So he then fled Syria, war-torn Syria, to London, and he's been appointed as the CEO of the Action Group for Palestinians of Syria and a frequent speaker on these issues. So we're eager to hear from you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk today about the Palestinians from Syria as a case study, and also the UNRWA's performance in Syria, whether before 2011 or after 2011, which is the start of the Syrian conflict. I don't want to repeat what other speakers have said before with regard to the importance of the UNRWA and how essential it is to us as refugees, especially against any attempts to terminate the agency or defund it. This is something essential to us. So I'm going to talk about the refugees in Syria. And in my presentation here, I'm going to go through 5 sections. First of all, I'm going to give you an overview or introduction about the UNRWA's operations in Syria when it started and how was the general conditions of Palestinian refugees in Syria, or the PRS at that time. And the second section, I will talk about how the situation was after 2011 until this day, how the conflict affected them. I will bring also numbers and statistics. And then I will talk about the UNRWA's response to the crisis, what has been done, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact assessment. Also something very important to us as refugees in Syria, which is the protection issue. And finally, I will conclude with some recommendations. So UNRWA's operations in Syria saw the day in 1950 in response to the needs of thousands of refugees. UNRWA worked to provide them with the much-needed services, including education and healthcare. At that time, Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA made up to 96% of the overall number of refugees who arrived to Syria. UNRWA works in Syria closely with the Syrian government, especially the GAPAR, or the General Administration for Palestine Refugees and Palestine and Arab Refugees, which is a department of the Syrian Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. UNRWA delivers services through 4,000 staff members operating at some 219 UNRWA facilities across the country. Palestine refugees in Syria have many of the rights of Syrian citizens, including access to social services provided by the government of Syria. Also, joining the labor market, and many other rights except for political ones. And that was since 1956, owing to Act 260. UNRWA official data points out that prior to the Syrian conflict, nearly 570,000 Palestinian refugees have been living across Syrian camps, inside 9 official camps or recognized camps, and another 6 communities in different provinces. Palestinian refugees in Syria managed to lead a reasonable and acceptable standard of living, since they can join the labor market and work in private sector and even in the state sector, unlike other countries like Lebanon. Moving to the situations after 2011, Palestinian refugees have been subjected to Syrian human rights violations in the war-stricken country, Syria. In a report issued in 2013 by UNRWA, UNRWA says, and now I quote, "Palestinian refugees in Syria were being killed, injured, and displaced in greater numbers than ever before, as the armed conflict continued to overwhelm refugee camps across the country," end of quote. That was in 2013, which is an early stage of the conflict, which continues until this day. The living standard of PRS dropped to the worst after the start of the conflict, and 8 years of war put them back in similar living standards to their parents and grandparents when they first arrived to Syria. Recent reports say that 95% of Palestinian refugees in Syria rely on UNRWA to meet their minimum daily needs. As violence continues, its impact on Palestinian refugees has increased. About 270,000 Palestinian refugees have been displaced at least once during the last 8 years. And in a recent report, this number was 400,000, which means almost all of the PRS have been, in a way or another, been displaced at least once. 28,000 Palestinians from Syria have fled to Lebanon, 18,000 to Jordan, 3,500 to Egypt, 10,000 to Turkey, and 350 to Gaza. Years of hostilities claimed the lives of nearly 4,000 Palestinian refugees from March 2011 to November 2018, including 600 who were tortured to death in Syria's state-run prisons. 1,800 have meanwhile been subjected to enforced disappearances in government prisons. At different times, 4 camps in Syria were emptied of all of their inhabitants, namely Sbeina, Al-Husayniya, Handarat, and finally Al-Yarmouk camp. Heavy siege have been imposed on the 2 largest camps in Syria for more than 4 years, Al-Yarmouk camp and Khan al-Sheikh camp. During the siege years of Al-Yarmouk, 205 civilians died as a direct result to hunger and the lack of medical care. The total number of civilian deaths in Yarmouk camp until 2019 is around 1,500 victims. Palestinian civilians were forcibly deported from Yarmouk and Khan al-Sheikh camps. Most of them remained in northern Syria and Idlib until this day. Some 1,500 displaced Palestinian refugees, among them 600 children, have been taking shelter in a makeshift refugee camp in Idlib city. A number of children and elderly have been pronounced dead in the area due to the scorching summer heat and freezing winter temperatures, and the absence, of course, of vital services. Since the start, now I'm going to move to the UNRWA's response to the crisis in Syria. Since the start of conflict in 2011, UNRWA has stepped up its operations to ensure the needs of Palestinian refugees in the country are met. The agency is the main provider of humanitarian assistance, protection, and basic services to 438,000 Palestinian refugees remained in the country. UNRWA faced the greatest financial crisis in its history in 2019, following the U.S. administration decision to cut $300 million of its contribution. At the same time, UNRWA says it is confronted with an increased demand for services, resulting from a growth in numbers of registered Palestinian refugees and the extent of their vulnerability and poverty. As a result, the financial support has been outpaced by the growth in needs. After 8 years, the conflict in Syria continues to be characterized by widespread violence, resulting in death and destruction, internal displacement, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, and extensive damage to civilian infrastructure. Civilians who have remained inside Syria continue to face significant humanitarian and protection needs. Within this complex and challenging operating environment, UNRWA continued to a certain extent to adapt its interventions to ensure that it meets the essential needs of Palestinian refugees affected by the Syrian crisis. UNRWA set a plan to ensure continued services, delivery of humanitarian services in the areas of education, healthcare, relief assistance, access to food, and protection from displacement. However, not all of UNRWA's goals materialized on the ground. Although UNRWA distributed cash and in-kind assistance to Palestinian refugees in Syria, but those aids did not meet the refugees' needs given the unprecedented high unemployment rate, which hit 78%, and 126,000 Palestinian refugees identified as extremely vulnerable. Another reason behind the dissatisfaction that UNRWA has also set tough conditions on aid reception. Those sheltered in opposition-held zones have been deprived of relief aids. In 2018, the AGPS, or the Action Group for Palestinians of Syria, conducted a survey to find out what the PRS think about the services provided by the UNRWA. 46% of the surveyed refugees said they find it difficult and dangerous to reach the aid distribution centers. In Lebanon, 89% of PRS live in poverty. 95% of PRS have been assessed as food insecure. And 93% of PRS depend on UNRWA aids, including monthly allowances for food, shelter, along with access to education and healthcare services. In very rare cases, this led to a better social security for Palestinian refugees. However, in the vast majority of cases, children were forced to drop out of schools to find job opportunities to help feed their starving families. On several other occasions, women have been their families' sole breadwinners. In Jordan, 100% of PRS are in need of winterization assistance. 31% of PRS households are female-headed. 30% are highly vulnerable due to their legal status and the government's closed-door immigration policy. For the vast majority of PRS in Jordan, UNRWA aids are the sole source of livelihood. Another significant shortfall in the UNRWA's performance is the refugees' protection against displacement and deportation, along with assistance of refugees in hard-to-reach zones or inaccessible zones, or those zones which are controlled by the opposition, including Deir Balut camp and Idlib, northern Syria. At the same time, there seems to be minor efforts by the agency in reaction to the obligations set by the Syrian government regarding obtaining permits for aid delivery in and around the besieged zones. About the protection that Palestinians from Syria need is the physical and legal protection, especially given the inadequate protection of the hosting country and the serious abuses and the human rights violations they have been subjected to. The most visible manifestation of the loss of protection is the death of more than 4,000 Palestinian refugees and the arrest of more than 1,800 others, in addition to the massive destruction of homes and infrastructure inside and outside Palestinian camps in Syria. In May 2018, Al Yarmouk camp, the largest Palestinian camp in Syria, was destroyed completely. At that time, Pierre Krimble said, and now I quote, "The scale of destruction in Yarmouk compares to a very little else that I have seen in many years of a humanitarian work in conflict zones," end of quote. Handarat camp was almost completely destroyed, as well as large parts of Dar'a, Al-Husayniya, and Khan al-Sheikh camps. With regard to UNRWA's buildings, the agency said it has 23 premises, including 16 schools in Yarmouk. Almost all of them need major repairs. 75% needs to be completely rebuilt, and all 3 of the agency's health centers in Al Yarmouk are completely destroyed. In Dar'a camp, only 1 distribution center has been left untouched. All 6 other installations, including 3 schools and a clinic, will need substantial repairs. In addition to their premises, 19 staff members of UNRWA institutions have died as a result of violence in Syria, as confirmed recently by acting Christian Saunders. The fragile situation of PRS in Jordan and Lebanon is also a clear manifestation of the loss of protection. Even UNRWA has not been able, at some time, to prevent deportation of many refugees back to Syria when this posed serious threat on their lives and safety. Hundreds of Palestinian families have also sought refuge in nearby countries where UNRWA does not work, like, for example, 10,000 in Turkey and 3,500 in Egypt. The majority of these refugees hold the registration card issued by the UNRWA, but none of them are covered by UNRWA services, except for some exceptions in Egypt. In Thailand, human rights data indicate that 179 families, Palestinian families, among them 50 from Syria, most of them have overstayed their visas while waiting for their cases to be processed by the UNHCR agency. Therefore, they have been treated by the Thai government as lawbreakers, not refugees. Some of refugees who took to the street to speak up for their rights have been arrested and locked up in local detention centers. In such cases, we have not observed a rule for the UNRWA or a kind of intervention or kind of cooperation with the UNHCR to provide legal services to work out this issue. As recommendations, Given the fragile legal and the humanitarian situation inside and outside Syria, UNRWA should take urgent measures to assist the Palestinian refugee community, should keep up its services in Syria and in other fields of operation, and to try to expand its geographical map to include registered Palestinian refugees in Turkey and Egypt and other destinations. Urgent measures also should be taken in order to enhance Palestinians' legal status and boost protection mechanisms for such an underprivileged community. UNRWA should increase efforts to hand over cash and in-kind assistance to Palestinian refugees, including those in opposition-held zones, and to ensure they remain safe and protected during their distribution. And due to the price leap and high rates of unemployment and the absence of labor law enforcement, UNRWA should increase its food, shelter, clothing, medicine allowances to refugees. And contacts should be made with the Syrian government in order to allow displaced refugees to safely regain access to refugee camps. And finally, mobilization of fundraising for the agency is imperative in order to help it sustain its core essential services. Thank you.
Ready for questions? This last intervention has been very poignant to me because when I'm on the Commission of Inquiry on Syria with the Human Rights Council, and what we'd always been able to say is that that was the only place that people were being treated well when I was with UNRWA, that the refugees in Syria were treated mostly like citizens. They had all the privileges of them, so they were our example for all other places, and now they're right. Anyway, okay, can we take some questions? Okay, yes?
This was quite a depressing session, I must say, but also actually quite apposite, because in a way the fate of UNRWA in the next decade, in my view, there is a lot of question mark about UNRWA in the next decade. I say this because for the longest period of time, the entire Arab region had a passion for something called Ummat al-Arab. And Palestinians actually were part of that whole identity thing. But I think now the Arab states are actually, what's the word for it, actually fearing their own survival, with the result that Palestinian states are seeking their own narratives, national narratives, their own national songs, their own national dances. And in that, the Palestinians are no longer important. They're largely abandoned, in fact. In fact, that Palestinian cause is largely seen as problematic to their own sort of national survival. And of course, Israel has played a very important role in that. There's no doubt about it. But of course, the Arab states themselves have played a very important role. I'm talking about the oily Arab states like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, Kuwait, etc. You know, they do fear their own national survival. They do fear that they can no longer afford to have Palestinian cause at the center of their idea of who they are. And the question is this: how can we remake UNRWA, which still makes Palestinians as a nation viable in the eyes of the region, not the world, the region itself? I apologize for this very problematic way I've raised this issue.
Short question for Ahmad. To what extent have the Palestinian refugees in Syria been caught up in the sectarian conflicts which are going on in Syria right now? Of course, most Palestinians will be Sunnis, if not all, but have they, to some extent, been affected by this particular problematic?
For me, I want to criticize now UNRWA. As a Palestinian refugee coming from Lebanon, I look at shelter as shelter without shelter for Palestinians, because they are providing shelter as a product, but it's not a process that helps us to maintain our dignity, our community, our belonging, and our kind of ownership. Coming from Lebanon, where we suffer a lot from the living conditions in the camps, and we do have that connection with our homeland and the image of our home. For me, I don't know my village, but I have that kind of image in my hand, in my head about my village and my home. My question for you, Sophie, because I am really interested to know the reflections, and for you as well, Terry, the reflections about Palestinians who are living in Lebanon, about the concept of camps, the concept of shelter, the concept of home, because like the situation in Lebanon and the situation also in Syria is very different from West Bank and Gaza. So I'm interested to hear that, and interested about also the idea of shelter without shelter. Like, yes, they are providing us shelter, but this is not the shelter that we aim for. Thank you.
So we take these first three questions and then go on if we have time.
With regard to your question, how far the Palestinians from Syria were affected by the conflict, actually we have been working. When I say we, I'm talking about the Action Group of Palestinians of Syria, an NGO which was established in 2019 specifically for this purpose, to monitor, to document everything, every single incident which affected the Palestinians in a way or another, inside and outside Syria. I'm talking about Palestinians of Syria, as consequences of the conflict. And regardless whether it's because of the opposition military acts or the Syrian regime, that's not our target. Our target is to document the humanitarian situation and to monitor and try to push this issue on the agenda of media and the human rights bodies. I can confirm that we have been through terrible news through the 8 years. So Palestinians of Syria were not away from any part of the military acts that restrict the southern Syria or northern Syria or western Syria. You can say there's Palestinians wherever you head. If you head north, we have two main and one of the biggest two camps in Syria, in northern Syria. So we have been there during the incidents that hit Aleppo and Idlib. In western Syria, in Latakia, for instance, the very first days of the conflict in 2011, in the third month, Palestinian camps, a very small one, next to Latakia city, was hit as one of the first destinations or places that been affected by the military shelling and military attacks. Also, Dar'a, we all know that incidents started in Dar'a in southern Syria, and Dar'a camp as one of the main and the most important Palestinian camps in southern Syria was in the heart of that demonstrations and where things started to happen in Syria. So Palestinians were affected in all stages of the conflict. And when I say that we have documented 4,000 cases of victims, I know this is not a big number, but we have also, we know that the real numbers are much bigger than that. But we also know that it's not easy for us, especially in such war place, to document every single thing that happens. So lots of, I may say that hundreds, maybe thousands of Palestinian refugees have been died, and nobody knew about them because their families were afraid to talk to us. And our people on the ground, our correspondents, our activists who are working on the ground, they used to face or they used to deal with such cases. So yes, we have been affected by the Syrian conflict in its worst level. Even inside prisons, when in 2015 news were leaked from inside one of the prisons about people who were killed inside prisons and they were tortured to death. We managed to recognize 70 victims from Palestinian origins. So we have been in every single atrocity that happened across the Syrian territories.
Sophie, you have something to answer?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So what became very apparent in the fieldwork in Lebanon, I think, is that well, first of all, I must go a step back. So the most important, of course, is to say that it's very important that UNRWA continues to operate and has a strong financial support so that this is not cut. Sustainable lives is always linked to politics and to political engagement. This means political engagement in terms of the right of return, but it means also, and these are very interesting developments, I think, it also means political engagement in the host country, in Lebanon, to no longer be this kind of scapegoat for the Lebanese political elite that claims there can be no support and no rights for Palestinian refugees, as this would as they claim, deny the right of return. So the refugees agency themselves and conceptualizations of struggling simultaneously for the right of return, but also for rights in the host country, is a very important development, I think. And of course, in the current situation in Lebanon, we see that actually different constituencies come together, and the Palestinian refugee community is very much part of this current uprising.
Yeah, two quick comments on the question of this idea of shelter without shelter. What I also hear in that is a sense of voice and issues of participation, and also that raises issues of power and decision-making. And I think in the last session there was a question about participation, and I think Mick answered it. And there's different views, as he said, about whether participation is working or working sufficiently, and in whose perspective. And you can see some of that when you compare reports and surveys. You can see some different variations in there. I think it's difficult in the context that UNRWA also is facing right now, from issues of funding to participation, and refugees and Palestinians are not particular or unique here. Participation and issues of democratic choice. This is messy, and it takes effort and it's tough. I can only, and it takes also then for UNRWA as a humanitarian agency, and we talked about this like back and forth between politics and humanitarian mandates. That shouldn't frighten us. And criticism, and I think also for the agency, criticism of how it's handling participation sometimes there can be a defensiveness, and UNRWA's not particular here too. are unique in this way. Other UN agencies responding to criticism have been sensitive to it. That's sometimes a function of institutions. But that shouldn't frighten us of focusing on these things. But those are kind of some of the things I think I heard. And basically then, I think there is a need to do more and to listen as part of that process. I'm a quick on the other the issue of I think the question was around what can UNRWA do to keep Palestinian refugees in focus on the agenda and not being sidelined. Yeah, that's. I mean, as Sophie mentioned, the critical and also the situation of in Syria is another reminder of that the agency needs to be, its most critical point right now is that the agency needs to be strong in terms of funding and doing what it does today. That's an urgent thing right now. That it's, but at the same time, I think it's also critical that if it's possible to do that other work at the same time, that other kind of deep thinking, strategic thinking. And UNRWA's been through that process. Karen knows. One of the questions that comes up to mind, and it struck me, I was reading recently the Organizational Development Report from 2005, I think it was, around there, and the shift to the language of human development as a way of framing UNRWA's work and kind of embedding it more in the UN system. And one of the things that struck me in thinking about, and I don't think, I mean, UNRWA's role is not a political role to search for solutions. That's the job of political actors. But when you think about, I think what the UNRWA's strategic vision in that document says, and then strategic place, is to do everything that it does in the context of human development. And it struck me when I was reading that recently, the question I asked myself, what would it mean if UNRWA thought about doing everything that it does in the context of human development and solutions for refugees? Not that UNRWA is going to change its mandate and focus on that kind of work, but is there a way when you think about and this gets to this idea I mentioned earlier, peace servicing, that was kind of conceptualized, that UNRWA, and Davis talked about that in his 60s report about seeing these services as contributing to peace at some point along the way through development of skills and citizenship and these kinds of things through the youth activity centers. That's already an old, that idea hasn't been given much conceptual thought since then. Are there other things, for example, I don't want to, if I can just add one extra quick thing. For example, the idea of statistics. What does it mean? Does the fact that UNRWA only reports or statistically on 1948 refugees, but also provides services to 1967 refugees, does that help or clarify just politically what this whole conflict is about? What are the risks in adding that other number politically? Who determines when you have indicators? Here's the issue of voice for refugees. Should refugees be involved in the choice of indicators? There's a whole kinds of interesting thinking about developing participatory indicators. And when you compare refugees in terms of what their human development is, in terms of education levels, health levels, indicators, do you compare it to the hosts? What does that imply? Does it imply anything? Do you compare it to Palestinian citizens of Israel? Do you compare it to Jewish citizens of Israel? These are the kind of questions that I think but they're not questions that I think that need to be debated publicly in a public setting. These are kind of questions that need to bring together experts in all these fields and practitioners and anyways, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, because I think, because I think that UNRWA does all of those things. I think when we have, we do education and all the other things, that we do human development and what you're expected to do as governments and so on. We could maybe talk about that, Terry. Okay, I'm told we're really over time, about 3 minutes over. Yes, yeah, okay, no more questions.
If everyone can come back in 10-15 minutes, we'll have the last session. Thank you.
الاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2009.